What's up guys, Agent here again with another build video, and today we're going to be going over the Sorc healer. So a lot of you guys might have seen some of the high-end healers in the game start to run Sorc healers in their endgame trials. So for example, Style Anima does a lot of Sorc healing, Tabata also does a lot of Sorc healing as well, and you guys might be wondering, well, why are they going with the Sorc healer? So the main reason why a lot of endgame trials guilds are running Sorc healers now as opposed to your typical Templar or Templar Warden healers is because Sorc DPS has kind of pretty much stayed stagnant the entirety of pretty much since Morrowind. They've gotten a few buffs and a few nerfs here and there, so their DPS has kind of fluctuated a little bit. For the most part, they've pretty much been trying to play catch up to everybody else. And in this current meta, and as well as last patch's meta in Wolf Hunter as well as Somerset, Nightblades have far surpassed magicka Sorcerer DPS when it comes to in-raid parses. And now with Murkmire, magicka Templars are also pushing ahead of mag Sorcs when it comes to DPS. So in those very endgame trial guilds where you're pushing for those last couple of seconds to get the highest scores, those little amounts of DPS matter. It's not that big, it's 3, 4, 5k, something like that, which in the grand scheme of things, you know, for your average player, isn't that big of a deal. The difference between a 55k parse and a 60k parse in a raid is pretty minimal for most of us. However, for those trials guilds that are pushing for those leaderboard scores for that #1 spot in the game, that little bit of DPS does matter. So what a lot of people are doing now are basically they're swapping out one of the healers for a Sorc in order to maintain that conduit synergy. The conduit synergy is very important to maintain outclass uptimes, and you still don't want to lose that. So the next best place to put a Sorc, if not a DPS, is going to be healers. That way somebody else, usually a Nightblade or a Templar, is able to take that DPS spot, push a little bit more DPS that way, and so it goes. So that's pretty much the reason why Sorc healers are being used mostly in those endgame score pushing guilds. You really won't see them being used all too often in other types of guilds. So for example, in Mayflower, we do have one of our DPS who can Sorc heal. He heals and DPS is on the same character, not at the same time, but he is capable of Sorc healing. But beyond that, he never really does that for trials. He does that more for 4-man content. And so the basis behind that is in 4-man content, not only can he heal, but he can also provide decent amount of DPS as a Sorc as well. So that's kind of the rationale behind running a Sorc healer in trials. First is that you get to replace a Sorc DPS with a harder hitting magicka DPS, magicka Nightblade DPS, and the second is you replace a Warden or a Templar healer with a Sorc healer, so you manage to maintain that conduit synergy, and you also maintain a little bit of additional DPS just because Sorcs do have a little bit of additional DPS compared to some other healing specs. So like the rest of our build videos, we'll be going over gear, attributes, skills, everything you need to know to basically recreate this build, and go a little bit in depth into your gear options. Because of the support role, you do have to be a little bit flexible, so you're not going to be necessarily tied to a single gear combination. You might be asked to run to certain gear sets, and then we'll talk about the philosophy behind healing, my personal approach to healing, as well as what I've seen a lot of other Sorc healers do, and kind of what you want to basically adapt to, because Sorc healing is a little bit different compared to Templar and Warden healing. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started first with our gear. Starting off with our Monster Helm set, there's really not that much of a difference when it comes to Templar, Warden, and Sorc healing when it comes to sets. You pretty much are going to be running the exact same set. So for Monster Helm set, you have Bogdan of Nightflame, you have Earthgore, you have something of Rkugamz. Those pretty much are the staples for healers. Healer meta doesn't really change all that much in terms of gear when it depends when you change classes. Pretty much every class, if you're going to be healing that endgame, that trial content, you're going to be running pretty much the exact same gear. So here we have Bogdan of Nightflames, one heavy, one medium. We are going 5-1-1 here. And much like the rest of our healing builds, we are going infused on our large pieces with prismatic enchants. Going with Olorime, definitely a very strong set. Outstrips SPC, Spell Power Cure, which is the only other source of Major Courage. You will need to have access to the Somerset expansion in order to get all the Rimes. I have the perfect version here. You can go with the imperfect version if you'd like. So the perfect version drops from Vet Cloud Arrest in any of the different configurations. So if you don't have any of the mini bosses, you only get the weapon. But if you start adding mini bosses, you start getting armor and eventually jewelry. The normal just drops from normal Cloud Rest, which is pretty simple and straightforward to complete. So the only difference is going to be that 5-piece max magicka bonus. So don't feel like you have to pick up perfect. You can go imperfect. As a healer, yes, the additional magicka is very nice to have, but it's not going to make or break your healing strength or anything like that. This is what we call a body set. So support roles tend to break up their sets into body sets and front bar sets, or in this case back bar sets. The idea behind this is there are sets with 5-piece effects that you want to have active at all times. So Olorime is a good example of this. So that 5-piece max magicka, if this was a front bar set or a back bar set, you would lose the magicka regen and the max magicka from the 4 and 5-piece when you're on your back bar, which is not really what you want to have. So this is a front bar, I should say body set instead. Other examples of body sets that you might want to grab are going to be Mending. Mending comes from Aether Archives. This is a base game set. So basically, whenever you use an area of effect heal ability, you reduce the weapon damage of anybody, all enemies within 10 meters of you by 400. I think it's 20 or something like that when it's completely golded out for 3 seconds. Even though it does say weapon damage, it reduces all damage from PvE mobs. PvE mobs generally just use a single damage stat to kind of calculate their damage. So even though it does say weapon damage, it will reduce spell damage from PvE mobs. The downside of running Healing Mage is that you basically have to be within melee range, and it only lasts for 3 seconds. So that's kind of the downside of running Healing Mage there. But as you can tell from the 5-piece, because it doesn't last for very long, you do want this on the body at all times. Jorvuld's Guidance is arguably a body set or a front bar set. Some people like to use it just on the back bar. Other people like to use it on the body. This is another set that you do want to pick up. So this is a light armor set from the Dungeon Scalecaller Peak. So you will have to have access to the Dragon Bones DLC in order to grab this. This basically increases all your major minor buffs and damage shields you apply to yourself and allies by 40%. And notice it's the duration, not the strength of your damage shields. So your major, so your ward, your shields are still going to be capped if they have a hard cap or anything like that. It's just the duration that changes. So Jorvuld's Guidance is pretty strong because of that major force that you get from Warhorn is buffed by this. So instead of lasting 9.5 seconds, it lasts for 13.5 seconds instead. So really nice to have there. More major force uptime just means more DPS that you're able to push out for your DPS. See where are my other sets here. I have a lot of different sets here, so apologies for trying to find them all. Sanctuary is another body set, so you can't really have this as a front bar set at all. As you can tell from the 5-piece, increases your healing received by 12% for you and up to 11 other group members within 10 meters of you. This is a pretty niche set. Generally speaking, you will not need the additional healing received, and there are some limitations. You have to be within melee range, so it's pretty much only useful for stack and burn fights. And again, healing received, it's very easy to overheal in ESO, and overhealing is generally seen as a waste of time, pretty much, based on resources, because your job as a support is more for buffing and debuffing. Yes, healing is important, and obviously the amount that you can heal is pretty important to your success as a healer, but like I said, it's pretty easy to overheal in this game between all the major minor mending, major minor vitality buffs in the game, and all the different sources. So I wouldn't necessarily worry about picking up Sanctuary right off the bat, but it is a pretty easy set to get. You can obtain it from banished cells. So as a beginner set, I would recommend at least farming for Sanctuary. You might find use for it in later vet trials depending on your group strategies. And then finally, we have, where is it? Worm. So Worm is another body set because that 5-piece is a static bonus. Reduces the cost of your magicka abilities by 4% for you and up to 11 other group members within 28 meters of you. So again, you kind of want this active at all times. So this is a body set only. It's a light armor set from Vaults of Madness, base game, pretty easy dungeon to farm, and this is definitely a set that you're going to want to hold on to. It's very nice to have. The only time you will never use Worm's Raiment is if you're running 8 stamina DPS. Even if you're running 6 stam 2 magicka DPS or any combination thereof, it's still going to be very nice to have the additional sustain boost, because it not only affects you and your magicka DPS, but it also affects tanks, pretty much everybody. And that additional magicka cost reduction is pretty nice to have for all 3 of those roles there. So it's really important to have Worm's Raiment available in case your group decides to run this. Now, Spell Power Cure, you still might want to decide to pick this up. So this is an older set. You get this from White Gold Tower, so you will need access to the Imperial City DLC in order to grab it. I mentioned this earlier, Olorime pretty much outstrips Spell Power Cure in every single fashion. You guys can check out my video kind of comparing Olorime and Spell Power Cure to see why I believe that is the case here. But Spell Power Cure, you still might want to pick it up. It's a little bit easier to obtain compared to Olorime in that it comes from a dungeon, so you don't necessarily need to rely on getting 11 other people to run a trial with you. But like I said, it is definitely inferior to Olorime, so if you can get Olorime instead of Spell Power Cure. So the final set I do want to mention here that I skipped over because it is not a body set is one that I'm actually wearing right now. It's Infallible Aether. So Infallible Aether is a base game set. You can get it from any of the Craglearn trials. So right off the bat, you might think that it is a DPS set because of that minor Slayer bonus, but the 5-piece better fits healers. Your fully charged heavy attacks deal an additional X amount of damage. Enemies you damage with fully charged heavy attacks are afflicted with minor vulnerability for 10 seconds, increasing the damage taken by 8%. So while it does say fully charged in the set description, it doesn't actually have to be fully charged as long as you prepare a heavy attack or halfway channel a heavy attack. It'll apply that minor vulnerability to whatever you're attacking. So pretty nice debuff to have. Minor vulnerability increases damage taken by 8%. So it's one of the most reliable ways to apply this. The next most common way to apply minor vulnerability is through shock enchants. Shock enchants are not really used all too often with magicka DPS anymore. You might use them as a healer, but there's only about a 60% chance for it to be applied when it procs. So generally speaking, Infallible Aether is going to be a little bit more reliable. It also lasts longer than Shock Enchants. The Shock Enchant only lasts for, I believe, 4 seconds compared to Infallible Aether, which lasts for 10 seconds, so 2.5 times as long. It's very easy. It's a very quick and easy way to just apply minor vulnerability. You go to your back bar, do what you have to do a heavy attack, you can swap to your front bar, and then you just spend that next 9 seconds doing what you have to do on your front bar, and then swap back and reapply it. It's a pretty nice set to have, really strong in terms of utility, and probably the strongest support set that you can get outside of Olorime. Now, in terms of jewelry here, in terms of traits and enchants, so I have 3 infused, but there is an argument for arcane for higher resource pools, for higher magicka pools, which is always nice to have. It's kind of up to you. You can kind of tweak this build to your own. I personally like the 3 infused, but I also see the appeal of 3 arcane because you don't have to transmute jewelry and it's still pretty strong to have here. So again, it's kind of up to what you want out of your build. In terms of enchants, there's really 2 primary enchants that you're going to be swapping back and forth, arguably a third. The 2 ones that you're going to be mainly looking at are going to be magicka regen and spell damage. Magicka regen obviously to help boost your regen, and spell damage to help boost the strength of your heals. So depending on what set you're running, because all these sets have different bonuses. So take a look at Jorvuld's Guidance. Jorvuld's Guidance has 2 magicka regen boosts, so you might not need to run magicka regen glyphs if you're running Jorvuld's as one of your sets. So one of the things that I recommend doing is figure out what your different set combinations are for your particular group. If you are primarily running one of maybe 2 or 3 different setups, get those setups created and figure out what your regen and your spell damage looks like in those couple of setups, and then adjust your enchants accordingly depending on where you need the most padding. Me personally, I like to try to sit at about 2000 magicka regen and spell damage, as close as I can get before any buffs are applied. So before I have my spell power potions, before I have spell power cure, I should say major courage, before I have major intellect and things like that. So I try to shoot for 2k. It's a pretty nice goal to get to. You probably won't be able to hit it all the time depending on the specific gear setup you have, but try to get as close as you can. That's my personal goal to hit in terms of regen and spell damage. Now for our weapons, for our front bar here, we have the Master's Restoration Staff. I have an infused with the weapon damage enchant. You can change this out for a shock enchant if you would like, for some more damage, as well as minor vulnerability and concussed uptime, which helps out your off balance, because you do need to have concussed in order to get off balance uptime. Other options here also include the Asylum's Restoration Staff. Let's see if I can find it here. So the Asylum Restoration Staff, as you can imagine, comes from Asylum Sanctorium, so you will need to have access to the Clockwork City DLC in order to grab it. The perfected version here reduces the cost of healing abilities by 30% after you use Combat Prayer for 3 seconds. The imperfect version reduces it by 27%. The difference there is pretty minor, so perfect only comes from leaderboard rewards, as well as completing Asylum on Vet Hard Mode. So don't feel like you have to use the perfected staff. You can get by with just the imperfect version from normal Asylum, just clearing normal Asylum. The Master Restoration Staff, on the other hand, is a base game set. It comes from Dragonstar Arena, which is found in Craglorn, so it's one of the more difficult foreman content in the game, but because you have 3 other players with you, you have 3 additional chances of grabbing a Restoration Staff. Then for our back bar, we're going with the Lightning Staff of Infallible Aether, infused with the Weakening enchant. Usually the healers are going to be running Weakening enchants to help reduce the damage that's incoming to the group, but again, you might swap this out. You might have an Absorb Magicka enchant if you need the additional regen. You might have a Shock enchant to help with Concussed and Minor Vulnerability uptime, and you might have a Weapon Damage enchant because your Shock damage enchants on your front bar here. So you have various options when it comes to weapon enchants. Again, I have an Infused for the stronger enchant bonus. There are a few options when it comes to traits for your weapons. One of the ones that I see more often is going to be Decisive for additional ulti generation for higher Warhorn uptime. I don't really see it being used all too often anymore, just because most healers think that it's not really worth giving up the stronger enchant for a little bit higher Warhorn uptime. It's not going to be that much higher, but it is an option there. You can go with Defending, you can go with Powered for additional healing strength, Defending for additional resistances for more survivability. You can go with Nirnhone because that boosts your spell damage, which gives you a little bit more DPS and a little bit more healing strength. So you do have a couple of options when it comes to traits for your weapons. And so that's pretty much it for all the different gear options. Like I said, work it out with your group for vet trials, see what your other healer's running, and figure out what gear combinations you will be most likely to run, and adjust your enchants and traits accordingly. Moving on to our character sheet, we are an Argonian. Argonians are widely considered to be one of the best races for healing. The other most common race you will see for healers is going to be Bretons, and then probably High Elves are going to be following after that. So Argonians are nice because they get 9% additional max health and 3% additional max magicka. So you have a little bit more magicka and a little bit more health. So it just helps out your survivability and your healing strength. Argonians also have 5% additional healing done, and that's pretty much unique only to the Argonians. So Sorcs don't really have a reliable source of minor mending, so having that additional healing done from the Argonian passive is really nice to kind of boost your own healing strength, because again, losing out that minor mending does cut a little bit into your overall healing strength compared to some other classes. But the big thing here is going to be the potion passive from Argonian. So whenever you drink a potion, you restore about 4,000 magicka, health, and stamina all at once, basically making each potion act as a little bit of a tripod. That just really helps out your sustain. So a spell power potion not only returns the base amount of magicka, but it also returns that additional 4,000 magicka. So you're able to basically pop a potion and basically restore almost half of your magicka all in one go. So pretty strong passive to have. Bretons are mostly used mainly for that cost reduction passive they have. So Bretons have 3% reduction in all their magicka abilities. So that's really nice to have to help out with sustain. They also get 10% additional max magicka, but they don't have additional max health at all. So Bretons are really nice if you want higher magicka pools, as well as increased survivability, because Bretons do also get some additional spell resistance. High Elves are really there if you want to also double as a DPS as well. So High Elves get 10% max magicka and 9% magicka regen, but their additional passive is all elemental damage, with 7% additional shock damage, 2% additional flame and frost damage. So if you are going to be using this character as another DPS on the side, so you're not healing all the time, or maybe you just want to do a little bit more DPS as a healer, then High Elves are not a bad choice either. Very similarly to Bretons, you don't get any additional max health, so your health's going to be a little bit lower compared to what you see here. For attributes, all points can go into magicka here. Sorcs do generally have a little bit more strength, health I should say. Not only does that come from prismatic enchants, but also from a Daedric summoning passive that increases our max health while we have our Twilight Matriarch out, so we don't have to worry about ever going low on health at all. You can see here that without any points into health, with our prismatic enchants, we're sitting at a little over 20,000 health already, so pretty nice to have. Generally speaking, the amount of health you want to shoot for vet trials is going to be around 18,000 or so. That's just because healers' survivability is going to be a lot more important. Whether or not you survive or not really dictates the success of the trials. So you do want to make sure you have an appropriate amount of health. So 18k is generally what's accepted for healers. In terms of Mundus Stone, you have two primary options for Mundus Stones. I'm running the Atronach here for additional magicka regen, mainly because I can hit my spell damage target of about 2k pretty easily. but you can go with the ritual instead. So ritual is increased healing done, so that makes up for a little bit for spell damage. So you can kind of pick and choose whichever one you want depending on what you really need in your build. So I personally prefer higher regen on my healers, but if you need additional healing strength, then by all means you can decide to go with the ritual instead. Finally, for food, we're running Clockwork Citrus Fillet. Don't feel like you have to run this. This is a gold food, so it is fairly expensive to make and to purchase. You can run with Murkmire's Potent Brew instead, or you can go with Orzagar's Red Frothgar. So those are your two other options here. So Clockwork is going to be probably the best option overall, but those two other options, Witchmothers and Red Frothgar, those are still pretty strong. The main reason why we want to run one of these three types of food is for additional magicka regen. While you could run blue food, you end up losing a fair amount of regen that way, and as a healer, your regen is really your lifeblood, so you don't want to necessarily sacrifice regen just for a little bit of higher stats or anything like that. Now going over our skills, starting off with our front bar, this is a Restoration Staff bar. We have Healing Springs, Combat Prayer, Energy Orbs, pretty much your staples for all healers across all classes. Then we have, we actually don't want Dark Deal. I need to change it out, so we actually want the other morph here, which is going to be, once I morph it. We don't want Dark Deal, you actually want Dark Conversion instead. And then we have the Twilight Matriarch, and then for our ultimate, we have Absorption Field. Then for our back bar, we have Liquid Lightning, Blockade of Storms, Elemental Drain, Overflowing Altar. We have double bar our Twilight Matriarch, and then we have Aggressive Warhorn. Now for our front bar here, Dark Conversion here is going to be a flex spot. So I primarily have Dark Conversion here because this gives us the Exploitation passive. So one of the downsides of running a Sorc healer instead of a Sorc DPS is that there's no real good ability here to help proc Exploitation, which gives your group Minor Prophecy. So if you're running a lot of Stam DPS, this probably isn't going to be quite as important to maintain, but if you're running a lot of Magic DPS, for example, if you're running, let's say, Cloud Rest or Asylum, where you pretty much have to run all Magic DPS, and that Minor Prophecy is really going to be helpful to your group. So the only good skill to really proc is going to be Dark Conversion, and this also helps with our sustain as well. The downside of Dark Conversion is that there is a cast time associated with it, so you're going to want to be a little bit careful for when you use Dark Conversion if you decide to run this. Now, any of these other abilities are fine options to use. Shattered Prison, Runecade, you can even use Daedric Minds if you'd like. The main thing here is deciding whether or not you want the Minor Prophecy passive, and it's all going to be depending on how much magicka DPS you have in your group. So again, if you're running like a majority stamina DPS, you might not necessarily need to run any dark magic abilities here. Now in terms of ultimates, I like Absorption Field just because of that additional stun. It's really nice for 4-man content, and there's definitely a few trials where you can actually stun the mob. So for example, in Cloud Rest, you can actually stun the Yagras that come out during the portal phase, not the monstrosities, but the small ones, and that can actually buy you some time and give you a little bit of breathing room, because then you don't have to worry about those Yagras doing anything for 12 seconds. And the additional heal is actually quite nice. So if you work it out, it works out to be about 2,500 health every second before you take into consideration any sort of buffs or things like that. So it's a pretty nice heal overall if you need that heal. Now the problem is it is confined to a certain radius and it won't move, so you need to be very careful as to where you're placing it. So it's more useful for stack and burn fights, and also by using this you are giving up your Warhorn cast. So that's kind of another thing you want to be aware of if you decide to use Absorption Field rather than Warhorn. For your back bar here, pretty much none of these abilities are really going to be flex spots here. The only real flex spot is going to be Overflowing Altar, mainly if another healer or another tank is going to be running Overflowing Altar, just because the synergies, obviously you can't stack them, and Minor Lifesteal doesn't stack either. So if you are going to be running another healer is going to be running Overflowing Altar, then you don't need to run Overflowing Altar yourself, and you can swap this out for another ability here. Liquid Lightning, again, this is mainly here for that conduit synergy. Make sure you have this out for your tank, so that way they can maintain good Alkosh uptime. Now, if your tank's not running Alkosh, there's no reason to run conduit, in which case this again becomes a flex spot. But I would still try to run conduit Liquid Lightning if you can, just for the additional synergy. Some other abilities that you're going to want to take into consideration here as a healer. Greater Storm Atronach. This might seem a little bit odd of a choice, but for 4-man content, this is actually not bad. You add in a little bit of additional DPS, but the main thing here is that additional charged lightning synergy. So if anybody who activates it gets major berserk, which is really nice DPS boost, increases your damage down by 25% for 8 seconds. Pretty strong. So again, it's something you want to consider, but you're also given a Warhorn, so I wouldn't use this in a vet trial, but for 4-man content, you might want to consider running this if you want to push out a little bit more DPS that way. Empowered Ward, if you want to run a shield, I would recommend running Empowered Ward over something like Dampened Magicka or Harness Magicka, mainly for the additional Minor Intellect. There's not many sources of Minor Intellect in the game, and so giving your group a little bit of additional Magicka regen is always nice to have. So I would run Empowered Ward if you want to run a shield. If you want a little bit stronger burst heal and you don't want to run Matriarch, you can by all means run Healing Ward instead. You will need to double cast Healing Ward in order to get the burst heal, so it's not that reliable of a burst heal, but it is something you want to, you might want to take into consideration. Mutagen's nice for 4-man content, less so for 12-man content because it only hits 2 people at a time, but it's really nice to have an additional heal over time ability going on in 4-man content, so you're able to focus on DPSing and buffing your group instead of, trying to heal people. Efficient Purge is another ability that you're going to want to definitely pick up in any fights where there are debuffs that you can cleanse. There's a lot of fights in the game where you're going to be wanting to run Purge, so make sure to pick this up here. Barrier is another ability that you might want to consider picking up. Shields got a nice buff in terms of they inherit resistances now, and Barrier gives a really large shield, so it's pretty much given everybody basically double or even triple the amount of health sometimes, depending on how much, how big your barrier is. So really nice to have just in case. And let's see here. There's one more ability that I do want to mention here. It'd be Bone Surge. So Bone Surge, you're not going to be using this all too often. It's a very, very niche ability, and you're mainly going to be using this here for the major vitality bonus that you get from activating the synergy. So it increases healing received for up to 4 people, the one who activates synergy and 3 nearby people, and as well as giving them a damage shield, a 50% max health damage shield. Damage shield is nice to have, but it's mainly that major vitality that you're going to be running for Bone Surge for. Again, very niche use. I've seen it being used in Cloud Rest for progression guilds. Mayflower uses it for our progression, for that major vitality. Very nice to have, but again, very niche. You're not really going to be using this all too much, but it is something you want to consider picking up here. I'll go over our champion points. I might need to redistribute these out, I believe. So starting off with our green CPs, we have 270 points to put across each of the 3 different constellations. That gives our that is equal to our cap of 810. Starting off with our green CPs, 75 Arcanus, 75 into Tenacity. Magic regen, resource return with our heavy attacks. Always nice to have. That gives us 120 points to put into remaining nodes, however you'd like. So I personally have 40 into Shadow Ward, 40 Tumbling, 40 Warlord, but it's kind of up to you how you want to distribute those. So you can put 100 into Arcanus, 100 into Nasty for that last 1%, or you can go with what I have here. It's kind of up to you where you want to put those remaining points. For our blue CPs, yep, definitely have to redistribute all these CPs here. If you're going for a pure healer build, then you're going to want to put 81 Blessed, 75 into Elfborn, or I should say 81 into Elfborn, 75 into Blessed. Just confuse those a little bit. And then from there, you want to put 26 into Spell Erosion. Most of the other blue CPs are pretty much all DPS focuses, DPS oriented. So depending on how much DPS you want to do, it's kind of up to you where you want to put your points. I personally like to do something like this, so 40 into Thaumaturge, 37 to the Expert, 26 into Spell Erosion, 11 into Master at Arms. Again, split them up however you'd like. The more important thing is to get 81 Elfborn, 75 Blessed here. You can even push Blessed up to 100 points if you'd like for the final 1% if you really want to min-max the amount of healing you do. That's another option there as well. And finally for our red CPs, this is a more balanced approach setup that I have. It won't necessarily give you the best mitigation across any single piece of content, but it'll give you good mitigation across all of them. If you want to maximize your mitigation, then you will need to shift your red CP points around accordingly, depending on the content that you're running. So I have 81 Ironclad, 61 Sixskin, and 64 into Hardy and Elemental Defender. Alright, so that's pretty much all the build information. So now we can talk about kind of the philosophy behind Sorc healing and kind of what's different about Sorc healing. So the main difference here with Sorc healing is the fact that you have Liquid Lightning. Again, you want to try to make sure you have that conduit down for your tanks for outcast synergies. So you're going to want to try to make sure that's up at all times. Not only does it deal pretty decent DPS, but that synergy is the key here. So if you have outcast in group, definitely try to maintain that liquid lightning down. Beyond that, your major source of burst healing is going to be the Twilight Matriarch. So the Matriarch is actually one of the strongest burst heals in the game. Now, the thing is, it doesn't always target you. So it targets itself and up to 2 other friendly targets. Usually, you are going to be one of them. So you can typically rely on the Matriarch to heal one other person outside of the group. Now, it does have a pretty wide radius. It's a 28-meter radius, and it does cover 360 degrees. So it can also heal anybody behind you, as well as in front of you. The only people that it can't heal are if there's a physical obstruction in the way. So if there's a wall between you and the person you want to heal, the Matriarch actually can't heal it. So the Matriarch needs to have a line of sight to that person. The other thing too, and this is less of a concern now that pets are basically invulnerable in trials, but it's basically you're relying on the pet basically for that heal. So if your pet gets stunned, I believe you can still use the ability here, but that's just something you want to keep in mind. You basically have an additional entity on the field if you are running the Matriarch. Again, with the changes with pets that happened in Wolf Hunter that made him basically invulnerable to most mechanics in the game, this is less of a concern now, but it is still something you want to keep in the back of your mind. Now, in terms of healing, my personal approach to healing is heal as much as is necessary, don't overheal, and focus on buffing and debuffing and returning resources to your group. So unlike Templars, your only source of resource return to the group is going to be orbs. So it's really important as a Sorc healer to make sure you have an orb out on the field at all times. I always aim to have orbs out no matter what. So if I see that there's no orbs out, I'm doing something wrong. I need to push more orbs out. Yes, there's a 20-second cooldown on the orbs, but everybody's going to be on their own independent cooldown, and everybody's going to need those resources, especially your tank. And it does take time for the orbs, depending on where you are situated in relation to the tank, to get to them. The orbs do have quite a travel distance, but they also travel very slowly. You can see just how slowly these orbs are traveling out. So if my tank, for example, is over by that light post over there, and I throw out an orb, it's going to take quite a while to get over there. It's actually going to take about 5-6 seconds for it to get to the tank in order for them to get the resources back. So for me, and for the group in general, it's very important to make sure to have orbs floating throughout the field at all times. So make sure to discuss this with your other healer. Always have an orb out on the field. That's probably the most important thing that I see healers not really focus in on. They're focusing more on healing, they're focusing more on combat prayer, but they're neglecting to throw out orbs every so often for resources for their tanks as well as their DPS. That's not to say you shouldn't neglect healing. So combat prayer is going to be one of your other strong burst heals. It's a nice AoE heal, so it's a nice AoE burst heal, but everybody does need to basically be in front of you. But the main reason why you're running Combat Prayer is for the Minor Berserk, the 8% initial damage done. That's a really nice buff to have for your DPS, so make sure you're throwing that down as often as you can every 8 seconds to give your DPS that additional buff there with Minor Berserk. Beyond that, your other main heal besides healing springs is going to be your orbs. Then for your back bar, make sure you are having somebody apply early drain to the boss at all times. It doesn't necessarily have to be you, but it can be somebody else. But early drain needs to be on the boss at all times to help out your magicka DPS sustain. Obviously, if you're running all stam, you don't need to run early drain. But if you do have magicka, make sure you're running early drain there. The last thing is to try to maintain Blockade as much as you can. So Blockade of Storm is the most reliable way to get proc off bounce on the boss. So as long as you have Blockade up and the concuss is up and the boss is not on cooldown, then you can set the enemy off bounce. It's very nice to have that off bounce for the additional sustain as well as for additional DPS from your stamina DPS. Stamina DPS will always have that exploiter passive in their CP tree, so that gives them 10% additional damage to any off bounce enemies. So pretty important to make sure to have that Blockade down so that way they can have that additional 10% damage done. And then beyond that, just use your Warhorn whenever it's up. So as a Sorc, you have a nice 15% cost reduction to your ultimate. So your Warhorn costs 213 ultimate compared to 250 for most other classes. So you're going to be having pretty good Warhorn uptime overall compared to some other classes. So make sure you're using your Warhorn whenever it is up. So it's really pretty hard for me to describe how to heal without actually showing you any healing, and I don't really Sorc heal at all. So I would recommend checking out Style Anima's channel as well as Tabitha's channel or Twitch stream to get some perspective as to how they approach Sorc healing and how they heal in their Trials guilds. So that's it for this build video. If you guys have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. I know Sorc healing is kind of new to a lot of people, but a lot of endgame trial guilds are starting to make use of Sorc healers in order to get a little bit more DPS out from their magicka DPS. So I would, if you are intending on eventually doing vet trials, I would maybe think about making a Sorc healer. Templars and Wardens are still going to be the go-tos for a lot of these guilds, but having that Sorc healer in your back pocket might not be a bad thing to keep in mind. Hope you guys found this video informative, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.